It is a pleasure for me to also welcome you all at the Center for International Development at the first Austrian Conference on International Resource Politics. I will be facilitating tonight's event, and I will start by giving you a short overview of what we have planned for this conference. In a minute, I'll be very pleased to announce the keynote speaker, Professor Thomas Pogge, who will deliver his keynote around 35 to 40 minutes on the topic of resource fairness from the point of view of global justice. This will be then followed by two comments by Christina Dietz and Isabel Feichtner, which will complement the ideas and thoughts of Mr. Pogge, but also address some key issues which he will raise. Afterwards, we will have a panel discussion and also a discussion with you, the audience. So we'll have, of course, only limited time, but I guess 2 rounds of questions, comments, and answers from the podium will be possible. And then we'll switch to the more informal, but perhaps also more pleasant part of the evening. In the basement floor of the library, we'll then serve drinks and some food. But now let me turn to our keynote speaker, Mr. Thomas Pogge, who's the Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs at Yale University and the Director of the Global Justice Program at this university. Professor Pogge is a leading scholar on the philosophy of John Rawls, and upon that basis, and also upon expanding upon that basis, he's probably best known for his work on global justice or cosmopolitan egalitarianism. And he's done work in particular on questions of global poverty and also on health issues. Resources, natural resources, feature prominently in Professor Pogge's work, and this is the reason why we have invited him to come to Vienna and present his views on the occasion of this conference, which, as Uli Brandt has already highlighted, is the first of its sort in Austria. A particularly impressive aspect of Mr. Pogge's work is not only that he is an eminent political philosopher, but that he is also actively engaged in activism against poverty and hunger. He has, for instance, set up initiatives like Giving What We Can, Incentives for Global Health, or Academics Stand Against Poverty. And that already brings me to inviting him to come to the podium and deliver his keynote lecture on the topic of resource fairness from the point of global justice. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Herr Raser, and thank you everyone for being here. I should say that Giving What We Can is not really my brainchild. So I was involved when we first thought it up and so on at a memorable evening in Balliol College in Oxford with Toby Ord. But it was his idea, and I was just giving comments on it and so on. All right. One other thing about ASAP, if there's anybody in the audience who speaks German, I've got a few copies of the first book that ASAP has produced. ASAP Austria is the first country chapter that has actually published a book, and I'm willing to give away about 11 copies or so to the first comers. All right. So, but now we're talking about natural resources, and I should start by thinking a little bit about what they are. You know, by natural resources, we are thinking in the first instance of things such as oil and gas and coal and metals and minerals and gold, silver, diamonds, things of that sort. But I think we should also include under natural resources air, water, land or soil. These are obviously also important natural resources. At current market prices, they may not contribute more than maybe 10% to the global social product. But of course, that is an insufficient indication of their value. Without natural resources, we would all not be here, right? Everything we consume depends on natural resources, and so in that sense, they are the sine qua non of all human consumption and even of human life. Now, access to these natural resources is governed by all manner of rules. We have rules at the international level, we have rules at the national level, which determine what kinds of ownership rights people can acquire, what sort of access rights they can require, and how they can maybe transfer their ownership rights to others. There are various different national rule systems governing these things in different manners, and so we can think about these institutions as having a very important impact on people's life chances. These are very important, very consequential and influential institutions. Now we can assess these institutional arrangements, both the international ones and the national ones, from the standpoint of different theories of justice. And I can loosely group those into two different camps. They're on the one hand theories of justice that contain a certain idea about how resource access should be regulated. So they lay down certain principles about who has what claims, which stakeholders have what claims to what resources, and then they compare the reality to those principles in order to see whether the reality matches and lives up to those principles or not. So these principles would answer questions such as what things are ownable, who can own them, what do you own when you own them, what sort of rights do you have when you own them, for how long can you own them, to whom can you transfer ownership, can you bequeath ownership, and so on. All these things are regulated differently in different countries, and there are theories that give an account about what the right answers to all these questions are. I think that so far no really leading account of that sort has emerged, and so I'm really for the moment in the other camp, which says that that question is really a secondary, purely institutional question, and we should have a theory of justice that just says what do we want to achieve, and then answer the question about resources in an instrumental way. So my answer to the question, what should we try to achieve, is basically human rights fulfillment at the very minimum. So I think all institutional arrangements at the national level, at the international level, should answer to that criterion. We should try to arrange our rules, practices, conventions, institutional arrangements in the world in such a way that insofar as that's reasonably possible, human rights are fulfilled. And we should then regulate access to natural resources and everything else insofar or in such a way that human rights are fulfilled. Now, to be sure, that leaves us plenty of options. Our world has progressed to the stage, economically, technologically, administratively, progressed to the stage where we can definitely and pretty easily fulfill human rights worldwide, and we can do it in many different ways. There's not just one unique answer. And so we can say, well, any of these answers is all right with regard to resources, or we could say, let's prefer maybe those rules governing resources that have other important, respectable conceptions of justice in their favor. So, and that's basically the idea that I'm developing. I say here are a few reform proposals that would certainly boost human rights fulfillment, and that would also be justifiable in terms of other respectable conceptions of human rights. So our world does rather poorly in terms of human rights fulfillment. So when you look at deprivations that people still suffer the world over, you find that at least half the human population suffer from one severe deprivation or another that rises to the level of a human rights fulfillment, of a human rights violation, or at least a human rights deficit. And so there is plenty of room for doing better in terms of human rights. And in addition, of course, we have the problem of the human rights of future generations. There's plenty of evidence that existing patterns of consumption will lead to widespread human rights problems or deficits in the future through pollution, resource depletion, climate change, and all the attendant evils that follow from these things. Now, some of these human rights problems, especially the ones that we suffer at present, can be greatly reduced through reforms that have little or nothing to do with natural resources. So, for example, through the adoption of minimal labor standards all over the world, or through the introduction of a universal social safety net all over the world that would protect people and make sure that they have at least minimal basic amounts of nutrition, of water, shelter, sanitation, medical care, education, electricity, and so forth. But in this lecture, I want to focus, since that is our topic, on 3 reform proposals that specifically have to do with resources and that I think would greatly enhance the extent to which human rights are fulfilled in this world. So the first reform proposal has to do with the ownership rights of natural resources at the international level, something also known as eminent domain. Internationally, we are now practicing a might makes right system with regard to natural resources. We recognize any person or group that exercises effective power in a country as entitled to control the resources of that country, and more importantly, as entitled to confer legally valid ownership rights in the country's natural resources to anybody they choose. So it's not surprising that somebody who has power in a country has possession, physical control over the resources in that country. What is surprising is that we grant them the right to confer legally valid title, property rights in resources. So we recognize, for example, you as entitled to the gas in your gas tank on the basis of you having paid a certain amount of money at the gas station. And then we ask, well, why should that gas company, Shell or Exxon, be entitled to the gas that they're selling you? And the answer is, well, because they paid that dictator in Africa or wherever they got their oil from. And that is surprising, that we should recognize these people just because they hold power in a country as entitled to convey or confer these ownership rights in resources. So think of some of the worst dictators of the last 50 years or so. People like Sani Abacha, Mobutu Sese Seko, Bokassa, Idi Amin, still in power, Theodoros Obiang, Suharto, Ferdinand Marcos, and so on. All these people survived in power thanks to the fact that they could benefit from, get huge amounts of money, often into their own private pockets, of resource wealth, and could then use that wealth to buy themselves the soldiers and the weapons that they needed to stay in power, even against the overwhelming opposition of their country's people. Now, I call this feature of our international order the international resource privilege, and I'm arguing that it enables oppressive rule, that it also incentivizes the violent overthrow of elected governments, often better governments, because every general, every leader of a resistance movement in the developing countries knows, if I can overthrow the existing government and put myself in power, then I will be recognized the world over as entitled to sell the resources of the country. I will get large amounts of money under my control, which I can then use to keep myself in power and buy myself soldiers, weapons, and so on and so forth. And then thirdly, what this international resource privilege also causes is widespread corruption. And the corruption comes about from the fact that everybody understands the dynamics of power, and so a government in a country that is resource rich understands that anybody who has some military power may want to displace them, may want to overthrow them and put itself in position of that government. And in order to prevent that, you have to buy these people off. If you're the president of Nigeria, for example, you have to worry every day that some general may have the clever idea of overthrowing you and putting himself in power and then availing themselves of the international resource privilege to stay in power. In order to prevent that, you have to allow these generals to be corrupt. You can't sort of just tell them, well, you get your $55,000 salary and that's going to be it. So if these generals enrich themselves, or you have to allow that, or if they don't, if they want more money, you have to give it to them in some way or other. So corruption is also bred by the international resource privilege. So three bad effects. On the one hand, it enhances the staying power of bad rulers. Secondly, it provides incentives for the violent overthrow of existing governments, and so it fuels wars and civil wars. And thirdly, it also breeds corruption. All of that is known in the economics literature under the title of the resource curse. That's a bit of a misleading name because it suggests that the resources are the problem. The resources are not the problem. Really, you would expect resource-rich countries to do better economically, right? Have better development, better poverty eradication than resource-poor countries. We find in the real world the exact opposite. That's not the fault of the resources, but it's the fault of us, outsiders, who are recognizing people on the basis of effective power alone as entitled to control these resources. So if we could somehow deny illegitimate rulers these privileges, this international resource privilege, we could avoid these massive human rights problems that stem from it. And that would be, of course, costly for us to some extent, for us consumers in the rich countries, because we could no longer buy the resources from whoever happens to be in power in the resource-rich countries. And so we would maybe have to pay a little bit more for our resources. But I still think that the human rights of people in those countries that are suffering from oppressive government and civil wars and so on are more important than our convenience and our saving money on buying these resources. Now, there are two different ways of implementing the basic idea. We want to curb this international resource privilege. We want to confine the privilege to reasonably legitimate governments that are representative, that have a certain authorization from the people, and also are acting to some extent in the interests of these people. One way to implement that would be by us laying down strict, rigid standards about what a good government is, what conditions a government minimally has to achieve. That is a solution that Leif Wenar is advocating. He's unfortunately not with us today, but he's written a series of interesting essays on that topic and also has a forthcoming book with Oxford University Press that will lay out that proposal. His basic idea is to take the Freedom House Index and to say that countries that score a 6 or a 7 on the Freedom House Index will not be entitled to exercise these privileges. Another proposal, which is the proposal that I would advocate, is to say this should be something that poor countries themselves individually or collectively lay down. So they can lay down basic conditions of what they think good government should consist in during periods of democratic rule, and then announce forward-going any government or so-called government that shall rule us in the future in violation of these principles shall not be recognized by the rest of the world as entitled to speak for us, to sell our resources, maybe to borrow money in our name, to conclude treaties in our name, to purchase weapons in our name, and so on. And if the people themselves declared it this way, maybe through a constitutional amendment, this would be a very powerful reminder of us that we are violating their rights if we do business with these illegitimate governments. And it would, I think, be a big step towards the solution of the problem. What you would need is some agent or agency, maybe some expert committee or something that is sitting outside the country and can declare in real time that a particular government is no longer legitimate and that any resource purchases from that government in the future shall be deemed illegitimate. Good, so that is the first basic reform proposal, and it can be supported also by other justice considerations that are independent from human rights, and so that gives them additional appeal. So think, for example, of the analogy. Suppose somebody took a few thugs with machine guns and took over the nicest department store in Vienna and then started selling the goods in the department store. Most of us would say that we should not recognize those people who, knowing about the takeover, buy these goods in the department store and pay money to these people who have just taken it over with machine guns. We should not recognize them as the legitimate owners of the resources. We would say that they have no right to buy these resources from people to whom they do not belong. And we would also say that by recognizing their ownership rights in what they just bought in that store, we are incentivizing people to give money over to these people with the machine guns. So we are essentially allowing the plan of those who took over the department store with their machine guns to succeed by recognizing property rights, their capacity to convey or confer property rights to these buyers.
Depends on the price.
So, what do you mean depends on the price?
The price they are selling.
Well, they would be selling it at a cheaper price, presumably, but still, I mean, what you're saying is you would buy it if it were cheap enough. Not good, not good, not good. Well, anyway, we'll discuss this in the discussion. You'll get your drubbing later on for your... This is good. It's good that we have some immoral people in the audience. All right, good. So here's my second reform proposal. The second reform proposal starts from the observation that the current appropriation of wealth from our planet, you know, this 10% of the social product that comes from natural resources, is highly uneven. That wealth basically goes to rich people and very little of it goes to poor people. So 10%, right, if poor people got their proportional share, then they would get already 5% of the world's social product merely by being co-owners of the world's resources. In fact, the total that they have is 3%. So the poorer half of humanity gets only 3% of the global social product. And of course, they work very, very hard for that little fraction that they get. So affluent people are using vastly more of the world's natural resources, vastly more of its fossil fuels, metals, minerals, and they also make vastly greater use of the world's oceans, lands, and atmosphere for discharging their pollutants. So this highly skewed use of limited and non-renewable resources violates and endangers the human rights of those who are forced by our consumption to consume much less, the poorer half of the present human population, as well as future generations whose consumption we also reduce by consuming too much. So we impose our practice of excess consumption upon them unilaterally without obtaining their authorization and without making any compensating provisions for them in recognition of our disproportionate consumption. So the second institutional reform proposal makes such compensating provisions and says, well, one way we could compensate is by introducing a global resources dividend, or GRD. This proposal envisions that states and their governments shall not have full libertarian property rights with respect to the natural resources in their territory, but are required to share a small part of the value of these resources with the rest of the world. The payment is called a dividend to suggest that it's based on the idea that the global poor own an inalienable stake in all limited natural resources. So as in the case of preferred stock, owning that stake doesn't give the poor any title to decide what will happen to these resources, so that sovereign power to decide remains with the people on whose terrain these resources are located. And so it doesn't interfere with national control, but it does give poor people a stake in the value of these resources, a kind of passive share that they are entitled to. Now, this idea could be extended from metals, minerals, and so on, also to resources that are not destroyed through use, but merely eroded or worn down or degraded or occupied, such as, for example, air or water used for discharging of pollutants, or land used for farming, ranching, or for buildings. The size of the dividend per unit of resources extracted or consumed or used could be adjusted to target specifically those resource uses that produce the greatest ecological damage. So here fossil fuels would be first in line, that we would put a significant dividend onto coal, oil, and gas. And just to give you a little sense of the amounts of money involved, think just of one resource, oil. We are currently using about 6 cubic kilometers of oil. That's quite a big amount of oil, or 6 trillion liters. And if we had a GRD of just 2 cents per liter, quite a small dividend, that would raise 120 billion euros annually that could be used for poverty eradication and development. So that's more, already substantially more than all the official development assistance that is now being given by rich governments to poor governments. And if we go beyond oil, or if we go a little higher than just 2 cents per liter, we could easily get to €500 billion. And €500 billion would be quite easily enough to fulfill all the social and economic human rights that remain unfulfilled in the world today. Easily be sufficient, and it would also benefit future generations by slowing the use of ecologically damaging resources, resource uses, and thereby reduce climate changing emissions and so forth. Now, initially, the justification of the global resources dividend is based on my minimalist human rights criterion, but it can also be supported by other considerations. So it can be supported by backward-looking Lockean considerations. For example, Locke famously says that we must leave in our resource consumption enough and as good for others. And so we are entitled to take only a proportional share so that enough and as good is left for others to take. And insofar as we consume more than a proportional share, you might say, we owe those who are thereby forced to consume less compensation, and the global resources dividend might be said to implement that compensation. It could also be justified on libertarian grounds. You might say that the present distribution of property rights in the world has come about on a path that is highly non-ideal. History was pervaded by enormous crimes, colonialism, genocide, slavery, and so on and so forth. And these crimes obviously have left their imprint in the present distribution, right? If you go back through history and track how particular possessions came to particular people, for example, how the present owners of land in the United States came to their possession, certainly there were enormous crimes involved, and we might say that we can't surgically correct these crimes now. We can't figure out how things would be distributed if these crimes had never happened. But what we can do is at least muffle the impact of these crimes by having something like the global resources dividend that makes sure that nobody is too badly off as a result of this very non-ideal history. Now, the third institutional reform proposal has to do with green innovations. We have a lot of people working very hard and very intelligently and also quite successfully on reducing our ecological footprint, of inventing things, various kinds of reforms, various kinds of new innovations that will reduce climate changing emissions or pesticide use or use of fertilizers and so on, methane emissions from cattle, what have you. So there are lots and lots of nice inventions, but the way in which we now reward these innovations hampers their diffusion. The way we reward these inventions is through patents. We give innovators patents. The patents allow innovators to have a temporary monopoly, typically for 20 years, on the manufacture and sale of these innovations. And they make money on that monopoly by hiking up the price, because there's nobody who can compete with them. Now, if you hike up the price, then the problem is that fewer people than otherwise would be the case buy these products and use these nice new innovations. Most people wait until the 20 years are up, and then competition is allowed, and you can get these innovations more cheaply. So in many developing countries, we are now using old technologies, very highly polluting technologies, where we could already be using green technologies. And that's, of course, pretty stupid, because the effects of that pollution, that excess pollution, is one that we all have to bear. So the innovative idea then is to reform intellectual property rights in such a way that we at least provide the option for innovators to be rewarded on the basis of the ecological impact of their green innovations, on condition that they make these innovations available for free, that anybody can use them or at cost in case they manufacture the product. So this would be funded maybe through a newly instituted ecological impact fund that would measure the impact of various innovations, seeing how much per unit these innovations achieve in terms of reducing emissions and how much these innovations are used, thereby calculating what the overall ecological impact of them is, and then rewarding innovators accordingly. There are different ways of doing it. I would start with a relatively small fund to try it out, maybe $5 billion a year, something of that sort, and divide that money among innovators who voluntarily registered their innovation with the fund according to the ecological impact of these various innovations. So the 5 billion each year would be divided among registered innovators in proportion to the ecological impact of their innovations. But in the long run, one could have a system where all green innovations are rewarded at a constant rate of money per impact, and the fund would simply be expanded to cover these innovations. We would decide how much we are willing to pay for, let's say, 1 ton of CO2 averted, and then would pay innovators on that basis. So that's the third innovation. Now I conclude that I have presented to you 3 institutional reform proposals. I would not want to argue that any one of them is necessary for the global realization of human rights, but I would argue that each of them would make a substantial contribution relative to the status quo to the fulfillment of human rights. What's nice is that each of the 3 reform proposals can be implemented independently of the others, so each of them is a module, you might say, in a larger reform project. And it's also nice that each of them can be supported by arguments that are independent of human rights and appeal to other, maybe competing conceptions of justice. So we can say that constraining the international resource privilege can be supported by the idea that property rights should not be acquired through violence and oppression. The global resources dividend can be supported by both Lockean and libertarian considerations. And the Ecological Impact Fund can be supported by the idea that it is a Pareto improvement, that it makes our world far more efficient, or in technical language, it avoids the great deadweight losses that come about from the fact that the cost and the price of ecological innovations are far apart from each other. If we could implement any one of these reform proposals, we would achieve a substantial reduction of poverty, of government oppression, and of environmental degradation, and thereby enhance the fulfillment of human rights. Thank you.